Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers for putting our paper on the program. This is joint work with Arvind. Let me give you kind of a quick rundown of what we're trying to do in the paper before I start going into the main results. So the idea of the paper is to study what happens around financial crises, both in terms of credit spreads and in terms of economic growth. One of the main challenges in the approach we're going to take in this paper is financial crises don't happen that often. Bad from the perspective of research, probably good from the perspective of everyone else that they don't. But so we're going to need a lot of data. We're going to look historically, and we're going to look over a number of different countries to get a large panel of financial crises so that we can say something more general about what happens around financial crises than just what happened around 2008. If you want to just look at US data, post-war US data, you're basically going to have one financial crisis to look at. Okay? There's some macroeconomists and economic historians that are doing something similar. Most of those studies, however, are going to focus mostly on quantities in terms of what happens to the quantity, things like GDP and credit growth around these episodes. The novel thing that we're going to be bringing to the table here is we're going to be bringing in data on credit spreads. Okay? So we're going to see what can we learn in terms of stylized facts about financial crises by bringing in credit spread data, and we're going to argue a good deal. Okay? Okay, so let me talk about the main results, the main findings that we have in the paper. There's basically two kind of categories. One is what happens after a financial crisis, and by that I mean a banking panic, an episode with a lot of bank runs. And then the second is going to be what sets the stage for a financial crisis. What happens in the run-up to a financial crisis? What are the things that might cause or predict a financial crisis? In terms of the aftermath of financial crises, what I'm going to show you is that the severity of the decline or contraction in GDP is going to be very well forecast by the initial change or rise in credit spreads in the episodes. Okay? So think about 2008. You're trying to forecast how bad things are going to be. You know you're sort of in this crisis episode. What we're going to show is that the jump in spreads that happens in 2008 will forecast how bad GDP is going to decline in 2009, 10, going forward. Okay? The other thing that's going to matter is the extent of credit growth pre-crisis. The way we sort of think of this is credit growth before the crisis is about leverage and fragility in the system, and then this rise in spread is about these kind of initial losses that's going to trigger the crisis. So both of those pieces are going to be important in terms of understanding how bad the crisis is going to be. We're going to use real-time indicators. We're going to avoid some ex-post dating biases, which I'll talk about later on in the talk. And then we're going to move on to what sets the stage for a financial crisis. We're going to have a number of results there. The first thing that I'm going to show you there is that, unconditionally speaking, if we see a big increase in spreads, okay, that's going to be very informative in terms of forecasting lower quantiles of GDP growth. So if you see a big increase in spreads unconditionally, most likely very little happens, okay? But occasionally you get this large left tail event where you get this big contraction in GDP. We're going to ask whether or not we can pick out when that left tail event is going to happen. Okay? And what we're going to find is that the big danger is when you get a big increase in spreads and there's been a big increase in credit growth in terms of the quantity of credit. Okay? The way to think about that is you're getting this big shock when there's a lot of fragility, there's a lot of short-term debt, there's a lot of leverage in the system, and that's what's going to lead to this negative left tail outcome. Then the last thing that I'll show you is that spreads before a crisis appear abnormally low, despite the fact that the probability of a crisis is sort of increasing. So it doesn't look like, in terms of spreads, that they're reflecting this fact that you might be getting a large crisis in the near future. Okay, so let me talk about the data first. Again, the big thing that we're bringing to the table is this new data on credit spreads. Let me talk to you about how we construct that. We are looking across 14 developed countries. You should be thinking Western Europe, North America, Australia, Japan. And then we have data on credit spreads from 1869 to 1929. We're going to construct that using old newspapers. Let me show you what that looks like. So here's a copy of the Investor's Monthly Manual. This is a publication from The Economist that ran from 1869 to 1929. It has a variety of different individual bond prices, banks, sovereigns, railroads, 4,000 unique bonds, 200,000 bond year observations. We're going to convert these prices to yield to maturity. So the people at the International Center for Finance at Yale helped type all of this bond data in. We took the individual disaggregated prices and tried to create some type of indices from that. Okay? So we're basically forming corporate spread over UK government debt across these different crises for this period. And then to fill in the gap from 1930 onwards, we basically patched together data from a number of different sources. We bugged a bunch of different central banks. We pulled data from DataStream, global financial data. That filled in the data going forward. Most of that is a corporate bond spread over a government bond spread or a safe corporate bond spread. So you should be thinking BBB Treasury spread or BBB AAA spread, something equivalent to that. Now, one immediate thing that's going to show up here is we need some way to put all these different spreads from different countries sort of on the same footing. Okay? And the way we do that is we normalize each one of the spreads by dividing by its unconditional average. So our spread measure, SIT, is going to be about percentage deviations from averages. Okay? That way, if you give me a AAA Treasury spread from one country or a CCC Treasury spread from a different country, we're kind of putting them on the same footing. Okay? We talk more about why that's a good normalization in the paper, but that's a way to make them all equivalent. We're going to have a total of 900 country year observations at the end of the day. And then we're going to cross this data on credit spreads with data on crisis dates from Shulark and Taylor. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a second, as well as some other dates on financial crises by Reinhardt and Rogoff, as well as Bordeaux and Eichengreen. And then we're going to cross this as well with data on GDP from Barrow and Ursua. Okay? The main thing now is we're going to have 44 financial crises from this Shulark and Taylor definition, so that we can say something a little bit more broad than just looking at, let's say, 2008. Okay. So empirical approach. For now, I'm going to just define this set of major financial crises, and then we're going to examine the behavior of output and link to spreads around each of those episodes. Okay, so how do Shulark and Taylor define these financial crises? Well, it's not a quantitative measure, it's more of a qualitative one that different historians have used and they've built off of. The definition for a financial crisis is major bank runs, bank failures, or government intervention in the banking sector. This gives us those 44 dates. They also have a list of non-financial recession dates. There's 100 of those. And we're going to compare the behavior of output and spreads across the financial crisis to these kind of regular recessions as well. Okay, so let me start with the first result. And the way to think about this first result in terms of the aftermath of a financial crisis is, let's think about what should we have expected starting in 2008. Okay? There was a paper by Reinhardt and Rogoff in the AAR called The Aftermath of Financial Crises that basically looked at a bunch of different financial crises listed here. They looked at peak to trough declines in GDP, which I've plotted here. And they said, on average, the peak to trough decline in GDP has been around 9% in a financial crisis. So that's a good thing to expect for this financial crisis. Okay? A lot of policymakers used this or ran with it. Now, one thing you'll see immediately here is not just this average decline of 9%, but that there's a huge amount of variation across these different episodes, right? Some of them are really bad, some of them are not nearly as bad. Standard deviation around 7% in terms of the peak to trough declines. And you can also see if you exclude or include one crisis, or you add one or you drop one, you're going to change that average number substantially, right? Because there's so much variation there. So what we're going to do with the spreads is we're going to use spreads in the initial year of the crisis to try and index how bad the crisis actually is. Okay? That way it's going to pick up a lot of this variation, and it's not going to be so dependent on if you throw out one crisis or you include another crisis, right? Because you have a continuous measure now. Okay, so that's what this is what that looks like. On the left-hand side in this regression, I have peak to trough decline in GDP measured from time t when the crisis starts going forward. On the right-hand side, I have spreads at time t in the first year of the crisis, lagged spreads, and then some other controls, the change in credit. what you can see in the first column is that if spreads are higher when the crisis starts, the crisis is going to be worse in terms of peak to trough decline in GDP. If you move over to the second column where you control for lag spreads, there's two things that come out. First of all, the R squared in terms of how much variation you're explaining is around 40%. Okay? So you're explaining a lot of this variation. And what basically matters is the change in spreads. Okay? You can see that by the coefficient on the contemporaneous versus the lagged one. One way to interpret that is that it's about credit losses, right? That change in spreads is really measuring credit losses in the financial sector in the first year of the crisis. Okay? Now you can see in terms of the variation in the realized severity, about 7.5% across these episodes. The variation in the expected severity, that's just the standard deviation of the fitted value, is around 5%, right? So it's helping tell you whether or not you should expect something like the Great Depression or something that's much more mild.
How does this quick decline is positive when it goes down or negative when it goes down? Is that regression?
Positive, yes. Peak to trough decline is positive, yeah. So high spread means negative. High spread, this coefficient means the higher our spreads, the worse the outcome's going to be.
Decline is not decline, it's change.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Here's a scatter plot of just showing the regression in pictures. We deal with outliers, dropping the Great Depression. We use different measures of GDP growth rather than peak to trough, using 3 years instead, shown there. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, rather than just focus on those financial crisis dates, I'm going to do a regression using the full sample where I can include additional controls, country fixed effects, year fixed effects, things like that. And then I can interact spreads with dummies for crises to get a full impulse response of what happens after a spike in spreads when you're in a crisis. And then that's going to allow us to go beyond these 0-1 dummies. If you just had the 0-1 dummies on their own, not interacted with spreads, that would just tell you this average that I showed you before that Reinhardt and Rogoff were pushing. When you interact with the spreads, you're going to get this variation in severity. Okay, and then we can compare that impulse response to an impulse response around recessions by using a recession dummy. The idea here is that there's some underlying shock we're going to call Z. That's the same in two different economies. That shock is going to cause a recession. In economy A, we have a levered financial sector. We have a lot of credit built up. That's going to lead to a financial crisis, even though it's a relatively modest shock. And in economy B, that's not the case, so you're not going to get a financial crisis, just a regular recession. Okay? So we're going to see if spreads behave differently across those two events. Here's what that impulse response looks like. So this is for a 1 standard deviation increase in spreads. The top is around these financial crisis episodes, and then the bottom is around typical recessions, and this is GDP, the response of GDP in years. Okay? So what you're seeing is, on average, a negative 9% decline, peaking around 4 years in the financial crises, shallower and kind of not as prolonged in the regular recessions. Okay? So there's something different about those episodes. Now, going back to this question of what should we have expected in 2008, we can do exactly that using the regression that I just showed you. This is using data only up until 2008. Here's the actual path of GDP in the solid line, and then the dashed line is the predicted path using that regression. Fits fairly well. If anything, it would suggest slightly better than what we would have expected, given what spreads were in 2008 and given that we were in a crisis in 2008. Okay. We have results for pre-war versus post-war. There's not a ton there that I have to say. There's more robustness in the paper as well. So let me give you a summary of these results, and then I'll go on to the additional results of what happens before a crisis and what leads to a crisis. So recessions with financial crises are deeper and more protracted than those without. 9% decline versus negative 3% decline. More importantly, there's this huge variation in the severity of outcomes associated with financial crises. They're not all the same. We shouldn't treat them as 0-1 outcomes. And that severity is captured very well by the increase in spreads when a crisis begins. Now, there's more results in the paper. The results do depend somewhat on the dates that you use. Okay? We use these Shlark and Taylor dates. You get somewhat different results if you use dates from Reinhardt and Rogoff or Bordeaux and Eichengreen. And moreover, you might still be worried that there's this kind of peek ahead bias or ex post bias on the dates. What I basically mean by that is, since these are kind of qualitative measures in terms of what people have decided as a financial crisis, the obvious concern is that there's a tendency to ex post call something a financial crisis that ended up being really bad, and you may not have called it a financial crisis if it didn't end up being that bad. Okay? So that's a big caveat with all of these results. We're going to try and get around that in what I'm going to show you next. Okay, so the second result, we're thinking of these financial crises as losses as measured by this change in spread or credit losses interacted with something about fragility, something about, let's say, leverage in the financial sector. Okay? This is why we're thinking about, if you think about 2008 versus 2001, when you can get relatively modest losses, when you have a lot of leverage, a lot of short-term debt, a lot of credit built up, it can lead to a much worse outcome. So the question we're going to ask here is, when does a spike or a big rise in spreads lead to a really bad outcome in GDP, and when does it not? Okay? And it's going to have to do with this, what we're going to call fragility here. So first, let me show you that not every time spreads increase do you get a really bad GDP outcome. Here are quantile regressions using the full sample. Here are spreads in the top panel here, and then this is the 90th down to the 10th percentile. What you can basically see as you go farther to the right is the coefficient significantly increasing. What that's basically telling you is an increase in spreads is particularly informative about a left tail event or a very bad outcome in terms of GDP. Notice too, if you look at lag spreads, it's also still picking out this kind of change variable, meaning that it's the shock in spreads or the rise in spreads that's what's really important, or the credit losses. Okay, so an obvious question that we're going to want to know is, can we tell when there's a spike in spreads whether or not we're going to end up in this scenario or whether or not we're going to end up in this scenario? Okay. Here's showing a full impulse response going out 5 years of, here's the 10th percentile in the black, and then here's the median in the green. So even if you go out farther, more severe for the lower quantiles than for the median. Okay, so can we tell basically when we get the spike in spreads whether or not we're going to end up in the black line or whether or not we're going to end up in the green line? So when does a spike in spreads end in a crisis? Well, we're going to try to measure fragility as the 3-year growth in credit to GDP from Shlark and Taylor. That's measuring whether or not you're sort of in a credit boom. And we're going to think of this crisis severity as losses measured by the change in spreads times fragility, how much leverage or short-term debt is built up in the system. I'm going to do something really simple to start, which is let's define a spread crisis or just a spike in spreads if the change in spreads in a particular year is above its 90th percentile. Okay? Just a big rise in spreads. We also have a small sanity check on this, that something happened in the stock market as measured by the dividend price ratio. That just nets out some of the noise if something crazy is happening to spreads but not anywhere else. And then I'm going to cut that into 2 buckets. Okay? Conditional on an increase in spreads, let's look at times when credit growth in the recent 3 years has been above its median versus times when it's been below its median. Okay? The idea is when there's been a lot of credit growth and spread spike, that's when you're going to get these really negative episodes. Okay, so here's regressions doing that. Across these different columns, I'm forecasting GDP growth 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, 3 years, out to 5 years. Okay? And then in the first row, I'm using just the spread crisis, just the spike in spread dummy on its own. In the second one, I'm interacting that with whether or not there's been a credit boom in the recent years. Of course, there's a number of additional controls here, which I'm not going to show you. Let's look at GDP growth 4 years out. Okay? If you just saw a big spike in spreads, you'd expect GDP growth to be about 4% lower. If you also saw that credit growth had been above its median, it would be about 7.5% lower. Okay? So what it's basically telling you is this, when do you end up in this episode versus when do you end up in this episode, has to do with this credit growth or this fragility that's been built up beforehand. Okay, now I want to go back and look at the impulse responses that I showed you earlier. This, I don't know what color this is, brown, gold, something, is what I have using the, am I really? Maybe. This is the impulse response for a shock to spreads when I use the Shularic and Taylor dummies. Okay? Remember, we were worried about that ex post bias, that you define things ex post that were a financial crisis because they were bad. This green solid line right here is if I interact spreads with a dummy for whether credit was high in the last 3 years or not. Okay? So that doesn't have this ex post bias issue. Okay? What you're seeing is a drop in GDP somewhere around 4% here. Okay? The black line is if I looked at regular recessions, and then the blue line is if I looked at everything unconditionally. What's really interesting is if you compare the blue and the green line here to what I showed you earlier in the quantile regressions, it's fairly similar, right? That's basically telling you when are you really getting this bad outcome. It's when you have the spike in spreads in conjunction with the fragility in terms of high credit growth. Okay. Let me talk a little bit more about what spreads look like in the run-up to a financial crisis. We know, and I showed that crises are preceded by a credit boom. What happens to spreads before a crisis? So here's a picture of credit growth rising, time zero being a crisis. What happens to spreads? Do spreads also rise when a crisis is sort of looming, when credit is growing very, very quickly? Here's a picture for spreads. Let's focus just on the blue line, which is just the average spread in the 5 years before a crisis. Time zero is the crisis, and then the 5 years after. Obviously, when a crisis happens, you're going to get a big spike in spreads. The interesting thing to notice from the picture that we have here, at least, is that in the years leading up to a crisis, spreads are about 20% lower than they are on average. Okay? So spreads leading up to a crisis look like they're low. The red line that we plotted here, we tried to construct something that we called the fundamental spread, which is a predicted value when you regress spreads on GDP growth, credit growth, all sorts of things, and use the fitted value. If you want to think about the difference between the blue and the red line as sort of the excess spread, that's how we basically think about it. So it's not about anything happening to GDP or credit or anything like that in these episodes. It's something else that is keeping spreads particularly low. Here's showing that a little bit more in a regression. So on the left-hand side, I have spreads. On the right-hand side, this first dummy that I have is a dummy for the 5 years before a crisis. Okay? So it's basically just showing you the picture that I had before, adding a number of different controls. On average, spreads are 25 to 35% lower in the years leading up to a crisis than they otherwise are. The interesting thing that we found that kind of explains this entire result is that normally the correlation between credit growth and spreads is positive, meaning if you're getting a lot of credit growth, let's say that there's a credit demand shock, spreads are also rising, right? That's what we would kind of expect. When we interact credit growth with the 5 years dummy before a crisis, though, we actually find that result completely flips. Okay? So what's happening before a crisis is credit is growing really, really fast. At the same time, spreads are being pushed down dramatically. Okay? Usually those things go in the opposite direction, except for those few years before a crisis. One way to interpret that is that before a crisis, you have essentially a credit supply shock, right? That's pushing up both the quantity of credit and pushing down credit risk premia or credit spreads. Okay, so the last thing I want to end with is to ask the question of whether or not, if you see something like this, which is you see a big boom in credit and you see spreads going negative or going very, very low, is that a cause for concern? Okay? And the answer we're going to find there is basically yes. So we constructed this dummy, which we called high froth. It's supposed to measure froth in credit markets. It's sort of based on this excess credit spread that we constructed. So high froth means that spreads appear abnormally low today. And then we interacted that with a dummy for high credit. Okay? And what we saw when we're forecasting GDP going forward is that the most significant thing is when you have low spreads and you have a lot of a big increase in credit growth. Here's doing the same thing in a probit regression, where on the left-hand side we have dummies for whether or not a financial crisis is happening. And again, we're finding the same thing, that if you have a period of low spreads and booming credit, that's increasing the likelihood or increasing the probability that you're going to get a financial crisis. Okay? Again, those are things that you could observe in real time that aren't exposed to the ex post bias. So let me conclude here. So the goal of the paper is to look at some new stylized facts surrounding credit and surrounding financial crises by using sort of novel data, which is including data on credit spreads and taking a long historical perspective where we can get many financial crises in there to establish as much of a pattern as we can. The results that we found is that in terms of the aftermath, the severity of a crisis can be very well indexed by the initial spike in spread or the initial credit losses. Okay? That captures a huge amount of variation in GDP across these crisis episodes that goes beyond the standard thing people do, which is just a 0-1 dummy for whether or not a crisis happened. And then sort of the economic lesson that we're seeing here is that the real danger is when you get these big increases in spreads and you've had a lot of credit growth or you've had a lot of leverage built up in the system. That's consistent with models where you have kind of initial losses times some amplification mechanism. Kiyotaki Moore, some of Arvind's other work. That's when it leads to a crisis or leads to very poor GDP outcomes. We also have this result that crises are preceded by unusually low spreads. Unusually low, given that low spreads are actually predicting, positively predicting a crisis. You would think, if anything, it would be the opposite. So spreads don't appear to be pricing an increase in fragility. This is also suggesting that surprise is sort of a key element of financial crises, that they're not priced into credit markets going in. Okay, thanks very much.